to renew genocide in Iraq. American soldiers were being killed then too. American soldiers have been killed on the wrong side in the Middle East. And maybe again, the whole reason why, that's why I mentioned earlier the disgraceful refusal to indict Saddam Hussein properly, because of the past complicity. Part of the case that we have to make for regime change involves the correction, the restitution that we need to make for a previous atrocious policy and conduct, for which the Iraqi people have a long memory, even if we do not.
Not a single American life was lost from 1991 to 2003 in Iraq in combat to save the Iraqi people. Nor was a single American life lost in Rwanda to prevent 800,000 Africans from being butchered in a regime that says, as abhorrent as Saddam Hussein. Let's remember, America's not here to solve the world's problems. America's here to solve its problems and figure out how it can best interact with the rest of the world. And I would advise the President and those who support this ongoing policy of aggression in Iraq to think twice about what the next step will be, because Iraq is not occurring in a vacuum, ladies and gentlemen. It's part and policy of a national security strategy of the United States published in September of 2002 that speaks of dividing the world into spheres of national interest that we, the United States, can inject ourselves unilaterally, preemptively, and militarily at our own time of choosing. This is not a policy of sound interaction. This is a policy of global imperialism that will lead to much more death and destruction.
Don't you think?
We will.
Don't you think it's time for the?
We will in a few minutes.
Not that I don't love all your questions.
No, but I'm enraptured by what's going on here.
I have a feeling that the lot of people came to ask questions as well as to listen to.
You got to leave?
Us? No. I'm saying,
I don't think they have to
saying, bring it on.
If you know Ritter looks like he's here for the duration. We'll get to it. I promise that Christopher is right. I want to assure everybody, assuage any doubts you might have, that we're going to send you home without giving you an opportunity to unburden yourself the way we've all been doing up here. So we will do that, but I just want to get to a few things. Well, I think that maybe you should flesh out for Christopher and the people listening, Scott, what the reasons why you believe, in fact, that the Iraqi people, pardon me, I'll have a ham on rye, and the reasons why you feel the Iraqis were better off living under Saddam Hussein than under the American rubric.
Well, I'll base it on...
That seemed to offend Christopher, and it might have offended some other people. I heard some Twitters there.
It might offend a number of people. Let me put it into a perspective that begins in 1991 as a weapons inspector in Iraq in December, looking at a nation that's still living off of basically the fat of its former wealth, including fat, by the way, obtained through the rape and pillage of Kuwait. Baghdad was awash with Kuwaiti goods that were derived illegally, and it was enough fat to sustain Iraq into this period of economic sanctions. But I watched Iraq delve deeper and deeper and deeper into a darkness that I don't think anybody in this audience, unless you were an Iraqi living at that time, can understand. It's the darkness, not of the tyranny of Saddam Hussein, but the darkness of the tyranny of economic sanctions. Economic sanctions that were responsible for the deaths of between 700,000 and 2.2 million Iraqis. However you want to calculate it, it's a huge number. Now, I also watched an Iraq that was desperate to try and get these sanctions lifted. An Iraq that recognized that the United States would never allow these sanctions to be lifted, even if Iraq complied with its obligation to disarm. And we now know, thanks to the CIA, that Iraq did in fact disarm in the summer of 1991. It's not a debatable point. What their intents were, I don't know. I can't get into the mindset of Saddam Hussein. I can only deal with the facts. But the point is this, that the Iraqi government under Saddam Hussein did whatever it took to try and get the status of Iraq away from being one of the poorest nations in the third world back on track to being a modern, technologically advanced nation. And this included oil for food sanctions violations. Not going to deny it. He stole billions of dollars from the oil for food program, but you know what? That's Iraqi oil. And he took that money, and with all due respect to the people who speak of palaces and this, I saw Iraq get better. I saw the economic life of the Iraqi people get better. I saw the roads get better. I saw Iraqi people going back into restaurants. I saw Iraqi people going into parks. It wasn't perfect. If you spoke up against Saddam, you were arrested, but I saw things improve. I'm not here to defend the nature of the regime. I'm making a statement that in January of 2003, you could walk the streets of Baghdad without fear of being stopped by an American patrol.
Yeah, that's true.
In January 2003, you could go to sleep at night without having to worry about your door being kicked down and dragged off by Americans to a prison run by Americans where you would be tortured by Americans. And an American, I'm deeply offended by this. We don't do this sort of thing, and yet because we have operated in violation of the rule of law going into Iraq, we operate in violation of the rule of law in the occupation of Iraq.
Christopher, what were your feelings throughout the long haul of the Clinton administration and on into the early months of the Bush administration with respect to the imposition of sanctions? And Madeleine Albright's assertion that it's worth the deaths, I think she said something to the effect that
500,000.
it's worth the deaths of 500,000 Iraqi children.
That was the Leslie Stahl estimate, I think.
Yeah.
She just, Madeleine Albright's a fool, but, and nothing she can do about it, but what she meant is, whatever the figure is, yeah, we think it's worth, that's more or less true.
Right.
I reasoned it when I could for myself, and whenever I could, which was not infrequently. I asked my Iraqi and Kurdish friends what they thought about it. And they said, well, look, it's terrible, and all our families are suffering very badly. But if the sanctions were lifted, there's no doubt that the surplus would go to try and rebuild weapons of mass destruction and to strengthen the regime, which is already profiting, ironically enough, from the sanctions themselves. In other words, it was like a prisoner's dilemma. The sanctions were hurting the people much more than the regime, but a lifting of them would benefit the regime much more than the people. Well, now, if you have a moral crux of this kind, what you have to do, I think, is make a choice. I remember Kenan Makir putting it to me in a very principled way. He said, it would be quite unjustifiable to keep the sanctions going on Iraq, entirely unjustifiable, unless the end result was intended to be the removal of the Ba'ath Party. Only on that condition would it be justifiable. So, I remember the anti-war movement, as it likes to call itself, would make, I thought, vastly exaggerated claims about the number of children dying, but nonetheless the number was very, very scary. And one would say, well, we could put an end to that, but Saddam would have to go. Oh, that would be too high a price for us to pay. Now, this is part of the bad faith of today's left, it seems to me. You say to people, all right, you believe that every day Iraqi children are dying. That ought to invest you with a sense of urgency. That should stop really very quickly. Well, we could decapitate the regime, we could reopen Iraq for business, we could bring it back into the international community in the way from which it's excluded itself by aggression, by genocide, by dictatorship and so forth. I said, no, that sounds like a bit extreme. I think we'd better let the kids go on dying and let Saddam stay in power. What is that? What is that?
Christopher?
That is the same, what?
No,
I was just getting my trousers off.
All right.
Well, look, if I ever haven't made the point that way, I wouldn't succeed in making it another. There's a tiny bit left over from an earlier exchange. I must tie it up. This repeated invocation of CIA authority makes me a little bit queasy. I've spent a lot of time investigating the CIA. I've spent a lot of time investigating its many crimes and misdemeanors and its innumerable subversions of the United States Constitution, about the preciousness of which I think Mr. Ritter and I are agreed, and subversion also of the democratic constitutions of other countries. That's only half of the bill of indictment against the CIA. The other is its unbelievable incompetence for what we now know to be a 400 billion intelligence operation, though we're not supposed to know even that budget. This agency is so reliable it doesn't even want to know how much we spend on it, let alone be audited. In return for that, the only American able to infiltrate the Taliban was John Walker Lind of Marin County, California.
We've been discussing The attack on Iraq and the occupation and the various elements and circumstances that led up to it or didn't lead up to it, depending on your perspective,